Hi everyone, my name is Rosemary Bernabe, and I work as a medical research ethicist in the University of Oslo and the University of Southeastern Norway. In this lecture, I will be talking about the role of ethical theories in research ethics. This is an introductory lecture, and in fact a must for anyone who is a beginner in research ethics. Understanding ethical theory is important because it gives us the foundation. It gives us the framework to understand discussions in research ethics or for any other types of ethics for that matter. Understanding these foundations allow us to understand why discussions are framed as such and therefore to follow discussions in the literature. But also, and maybe more importantly, to engage ourselves in such a discussion. So the basic question that we will answer in this lecture is this: what is the role of ethical theories in research ethics? To do that, we should begin, or it might be best to begin with some example cases. And this is case number one. The sponsor of a phase 3 clinical trial on an add-on drug for tuberculosis was required by the ethics committee to provide post-trial access to the study participants in case safety and efficacy are established. This means the provision of the drug for the whole course for the few thousand participants. That means provision of the add-on drug for a certain amount of time for all the study participants. This would be an unforeseen cost for the sponsor. Is this requirement imposed by the ethics committee ethically justified? Second case, clinical trials in low and middle income countries are usually meant not for the host country, but for the country of the sponsor, that is the United States and a major part of Europe, or shall we say Central Europe. This is why medicines tried in low and middle income countries address the major causes of morbidity and mortality in high income regions and not necessarily of the former, that is of the low and middle income countries. And are such trials justified? Now in this case, we're talking about the responsiveness of clinical trial. Of course, a clinical trial, once it's done in a low and middle income countries, presuppose the existence of such a disease in this low or middle income country. But the issue here is not so much whether the disease is present in the low and middle income country, but rather does it address the gravest needs of the low and middle income countries, or do they address the gravest needs of the sponsor country, that is of the US and Europe? Most of the time, studies show that such trials address the needs of the high income regions and not necessarily the gravest needs of the low and middle income regions. So are such clinical trials justified? And if so, why are they justified? Now, if you would notice, these are very difficult questions, right? We would probably have our own intuitions moving towards one kind of judgment or one type of judgment against another. We would say it's justified or it's not justified. And we probably have experiences or ideas, or probably read it in the news or in the newspapers, right? So we would have, of course, our intuitions on how we want to go about these cases or what our dispositions are, right? But that's not necessarily doing ethics. So maybe we have to begin. Before we are even able to answer the question of what is the role of ethical theories in research ethics, we have to begin understanding what ethics is all about. And one good way is to make a distinction between morality and ethics. So when we say morality, this is something very social, very cultural, and it refers to the evaluation of human actions. By human actions, we refer to something that was done with intentionality and freedom, something that you chose, something that you chose to do, something that you chose to say, something that you chose to insist on, right? Now, if I say this human act, shall we say lying? Lying is bad, or lying is good in this particular instance. That is an example of morality. That I evaluate this human act by saying that it is either good or bad, or maybe neutral. Or maybe we can even go into moralities that we see are present depending on that are usually dependent on socio-cultural norms. For example, abortion is bad or abortion is good, or homosexuality is bad or homosexuality is good. Okay, these are moralities. Now, once we start reflecting on moralities, systematically reflecting on such moralities, and going through the process of justification for such a reflection, then we start doing ethics. So when we say, well, okay, we say that lying in this particular instance is bad, but why is it bad? Is that judgment that lying in this particular bad, is that an ethically justifiable statement or not? Once we start going into questioning a morality and systematically reflecting on them, then we start doing ethics. Okay. Now, again, we cannot go on answering what is the relevance of ethical theories to research ethics without knowing at least some of the ethical theories. So the next thing we do now is just to go through these ethical theories, at least some of the major ones, or shall we say, and some of the more popular ones, shall we say? Yeah. Well, at least for ethicists and philosophers, so the two, shall we say, greatest, not great because they're, well, yeah, they're plainly fantastic, great in the sense that they're very big and they're very influential. Now, two of the great ethical theories is what we call the teleological ethics and the ontological ethics. So we go to teleological ethics first, coming from the Greek word telos, end. So for teleological ethics, the basic or ultimate criterion or standard of what is morally right, wrong, obligatory, etc., is a non-moral value. And what is this non-moral value? The most famous of all the teleological ethical theories is what we call utilitarianism. So in utilitarianism, what is this non-moral virtue? So for utilitarians, they say that the greatest happiness or the greatest utility for the greatest number is what is worth striving for. Yeah, and therefore an action or a decision that is geared towards this greatest happiness or greatest utility for the greatest number would be what is considered ethically good. And what leads to the greatest disutility and to the greatest unhappiness would be considered ethically bad. Right? Now, of course, there's always the question of greatest number for whom, and are we referring to greatest number and the greatest happiness at one point, immediate, or are we talking about something that happens eventually? Yes. So even among utilitarians, there is this discussion, but at least for our purposes, we don't need to go through these differences now. Another great ethical theory is what we call deontological ethics, coming from the Greek word deon, meaning duty or obligation. So deontological ethicists judge morality, judge the morality of choices by criteria different from the state of affairs those choices bring about. That is, deontological ethicists judge morality not necessarily based on consequences. So this is like the antithesis of teleological ethics, as we saw a while ago, right? So this is the kind of ethics that's called sometimes rights-based, dignity-based, duty-based. And the most famous of them all would be Immanuel Kant. And so Immanuel Kant is the philosopher who talked about categorical imperatives. Yeah. So the first categorical imperative says this: an action is permissible if and only if it is performed on the basis of a maxim that one can will to be a universal law. What does that mean? It means that an action is morally or ethically permissible only if that action is performed after reflecting whether or not that action can be made into a universal law, whether that action can be universalizable. So for example, again, just typical examples we were giving a while ago, like for example, let's say stealing or lying or cheating or whatever it is that you can think under the sun. No, so we go back to this issue of lying. If before I lie for because of something or because of someone, I think about the action. Can I make it universalizable that lying is because of this, or simply lying is something that is something that's universally good? If I cannot justify in my head that lying is something that can be made universal, then my act of lying is ethically unpermissible or impermissible. Okay. Then we can apply that in many different situations. So if we say being prejudicial to other people, can we say that being prejudicial because of one's color or because of one's ethnicity is something that is universalizable? That means wherever you go, whatever you do, it's okay that we are prejudicial against others because of their ethnicity. If that's not something that you can justify by reason as something that can be universalized, then that action of being prejudicial towards another because of one's ethnicity cannot be considered as ethically permissible. Okay. And now he has another categorical imperative, which is supposed to be the other side of the same coin, which says we ought to always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Now that means that even if we have a very utilitarian relationship with another person, we can never see that other person merely as means towards some utility, but always seeing that person as inherently valuable. That is, that person has a dignity. And that's what I mean by inherently valuable. That person has dignity. Right? So think of the employer-employee relationship. Of course, the employer employs employees for purposes of building a business. Right? But that relationship cannot simply be cannot simply remain in the realm of building a business and then that's it. Right? So that this means that this employer is also required by ethics and eventually by law, required by ethics to treat the employees in such a way that they're given proper wages, that they have a good work environment, that they have all the rights and privileges that should go to them as employees, but also as human beings. Okay. All right. So this is the ontological ethics. It says that, well, okay, sure, we might have ends that in the end would give the greatest happiness for the greatest number of persons, but that shouldn't be the basis of saying that an action or a choice is good or bad. It has to be what are you obligated to do? What is your duty, as opposed to what the goal or what the end is for the greatest number of people. So even if an action might give the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, in the end, that's not the measure of a good human act. A good human act is so because it is based on duty, or it is respectful of rights, or it is respectful of dignity. Okay. Now, especially in contemporary ethical theories, but also in contemporary political philosophy, there's what we call the human development approach, also called the capabilities approach. And the most famous of these philosophers will be Martha Nussbaum. Another one is Amartya Sen. But I will go through Martha Nussbaum's capability approach here. So the capabilities approach provides a threshold for the possibility of a good life. What do we mean by threshold? It means that anything below it, means that reaching a flourishing life or a good life is denied once you go below such a threshold. Now, Nussbaum provides a tentative list of capabilities living below which would be tantamount to not making human functioning available to citizens. Now she used the word citizens, meaning that this is more or less the responsibility of those who have a responsibility towards citizens. So of course we have the government, but we also have great institutions. And what is this threshold that we're talking about here? So Martha Nussbaum provides a list, and living below such a list means living a life that is not flourishing, or at least incomplete in terms of human flourishing. So the list includes life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. And of course, each one in this list could be further elaborated and explained, and maybe also make a sub-list out of them. And again, that's not the interest that we have here. But let me just say it quickly that increasing one aspect of the list does not compensate for losses when you are suffering from the lack of another in that list. So, for example, you cannot. It's not considered human flourishing that you are so physically healthy, that is bodily health, but at the same time, your affiliation or your relationships with other human beings, you choose to have a relationship with, suffers, or you don't have it, right? So a life that is incomplete in terms of the list or threshold is a life that is not flourishing or humanly functioning. It means it's incomplete. It means something needs to be done. Right, so if you would have noticed, this capabilities approach puts a solution to the problems posed a while ago by the utilitarian doctrine of greatest happiness for the greatest number, because here what we see is not only the aggregate. Sure, the aggregate is there because we're talking about great institutions. We're talking about the government making sure that these human functionings are available to the citizens. But at the same time, we're talking about individuals, that this individual or that this minority group of individuals or this other group of individuals have the capacity, to reach human flourishing because these capabilities in this list are made available to them. Take note of the word available to. Because in the end, whether or not you respect your body is a choice, right? So the responsibility of governments or great institutions, is to make to make such capabilities available to the citizens. Okay. So this approach also addresses the problem of considering desires a sufficient determinant of needs. So we can't say just because you like it, then that's the only thing that you need. precisely because there's a list. And also the problem of understanding development only in economic terms. That just because you have this addresses the issue of like minimizing development, as if development is only about GDP. Development, human development, refers to access to all of these in this list. Another ethical theory, which is also something that's frequently used recently, is what we call coherentism, and the most famous of which is what we call reflective equilibrium by John Rawls. So this is a type of ethical theory wherein what is ethical or what is ethically acceptable goes through a process. So a decision is reached by a deliberative process in which our pre-theoretical intuitions play an important role, but are open to critical reflection that may lead to changes, modifications, and revisions. In reflective equilibrium, as in other coherentistic theories, no particular belief or assumption is privileged as a foundation. What does that mean? It means that if you are applying the process of reflective equilibrium, you would have your pre-theoretical intuitions. This human act is considered ethical or justified. But then that's pre-theoretical. It means that that's what we call intuitions or biases, right? So if you're applying reflective equilibrium, it means that you write down or you put on the table your pre-theoretical intuitions, but that's not it. But that's not enough, right? So you have your pre-theoretical intuitions, but then you put also on the table, equal to your pre-theoretical intuitions, other considerations, the opinion of others, maybe more information, other things that can complement to or even against your pre-theoretical intuitions, and you start trying to weigh them, put them in, and the goal is, as the term requires, the goal is to have some sort of an equilibrium. If something is if in the process of reflective equilibrium you see that, oh, something is not making sense here, or one thing is just not making sense, and that's then or if this aspect here challenges my pre-theoretical intuitions, then you try to look further into it, look into other aspects, look into other opinions, look into other justifications, look into other facts, look further into the facts, because then in the process you might actually change, modify, or revise your pre-theoretical intuition towards a certain kind of equilibrium. Yeah. So this is reflective equilibrium. Now, when we talk of research ethics, one approach that uses reflective equilibrium is what we call the principles of approach, championed by Beauchamp and Childress. So what is the principles approach? The principles approach is a way of doing ethics, specifically medical ethics, research ethics, wherein there are 4 principles. That is autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. So a while ago in reflective equilibrium, nothing is everything's equal. But in the principles approach, there are 4 principles that you start weighing to create a certain kind of equilibrium. So it is possible that in a specific case, only one of the principles might be relevant, but it is also possible that in one case, 2 principles might be canceling out each other, or against, or are in deadlock. So, but let me just go through these principles very quickly. What is the principle of autonomy? That is a principle wherein you respect the other person as a self-governing, just like you are self-governing and the other person is too. No, and therefore you do not experiment on other people without their consent, and therefore now we have this whole instrument called informed consent. There's also what we call non-maleficence, that is that when in any medical intervention, whether clinical or in practice or in research rather, then we cannot put the other person in at risk for unjustified reasons. That is, we cannot do no harm. Yeah? So, for example, it might be that a person needs surgery. That is intervention. But a surgery is surgery because there is a medical reason for doing so. There's a medical justifiable reason for doing so. Yeah? But opening up another person without that medical justification makes that action not anymore an act of surgery, but it is exploitation, right? So it can also be manslaughter, right? So one is medical, another is criminal. And the non-maleficence means doesn't mean not doing the surgery. Of course, you are justified to do medical procedures, but once you do it without the same reason, it changes meaning. Then you start being maleficent. Then you start being harmful. Okay. And an example of how this is applied in research ethics or in medical ethics is what we call protecting vulnerable patients. Now, so in research ethics, individuals who are considered vulnerable, for example, children, are provided additional protection. Now, so children cannot decide for themselves. So the additional protection is, of course, making sure that there's the consent of the parents or the guardian, on top of speaking with a child who is already able to understand. Another principle is what you call beneficence, that is benefiting the other or doing what is good. So a while ago, we talked about post-trial obligations. It could be, when we say providing benefit, it could be providing benefit to research participants, but also simply making sure when it comes to the clinical setting, making sure that that the goal of a clinical intervention is, of course, the good of the patient, not the good of the doctor, not the good of the hospital, but the good of the patient, right? In research ethics, we have what we call the balancing of risk and benefits. And one of the tenets say that research is justified only if risks do not outweigh benefits. That ideally benefits should outweigh the risk, but at the minimum, risks should be balanced to what the benefits are. Now, of course, there will be issues on what are the risks and what are the benefits. Benefits to whom, and what kind of benefits are these? And again, risks to whom and what kinds of risks are these, right? And again, that becomes a whole big discussion. But anyway, the basic idea is that whether it's clinic or research, an intervention must be beneficial to, ideally, the research participants or the patients. And lastly, we have justice. The word justice is of course very big and sometimes very difficult to define. Yeah, justice can be considered as fairness. Justice it has also been defined as giving another person what is due to him or her. But at least when it comes to research or even in a clinical setting, justice has most of the time also been viewed or defined as fair distribution. Right. So in research ethics, this refers to, for example, fair opportunities in trial. Right. So it could be, several research have shown that women are underrepresented in certain types of clinical trials. For example, in cancer trials outside breast cancer. And if women are not represented in such trials, it means that medications are not necessarily optimal, or we don't know if they are optimal to women, right? So we want to make sure that those who will be using a medicine, are appropriately represented in studies, so that a drug would be optimal for them, or that if there are severe, or shall we say rare adverse events, that we are able to detect them. Okay, now an example that I said a while ago, that the principles approach is a version of the reflective equilibrium, but just that in this case, it gives primacy to 4 principles. So we can give an example. An example would be, if you are a medical doctor and you have patients, and these patients, you would want to enroll them in a clinical trial, and in the process, the doctor receives, say, $100 for each patient that was enrolled. So then we have the duty of the doctor to protect the patient, that is non-maleficent. No, but at the same time, there's also the benefit that the doctor receives, but also the potential benefit to the patients who might become research participants, who might benefit from the study. So and of course that means several of these principles clashing against each other. What then do we do? So again, since this is a reflective equilibrium approach, that means looking into these theories, putting them on the table, putting all the facts on the table, and start weighing them, and hopefully you reach a certain type of equilibrium. The goal is to reach reflective equilibrium. All right, now enough of ethical theories. The purpose of this lecture, this short lecture, is to talk about, or to look into what is the role of ethical theories in research ethics. So we have looked into some case examples in research ethics, and we have looked into ethical theory, right? So then, what is the role? And this is a very short response. Ethical theories and principles provide anchors on the following: what are the relevant aspects of the case, and how to systematically process ethical justification. Now, what I want to do would be to look into those 2 cases again and see how these ethical theories actually point to the relevant aspects of the case, and how they help us reach, shall we say, some sort of an ethical justification to reach some sort of a decision. So this is the first case you saw a while ago. The sponsor of a phase 3 clinical trial on an add-on drug for tuberculosis, required by ethics committees to provide post-trial access to the add-on drug to the trial participants for a certain amount of time. And this means unforeseen costs for the sponsor. Is this requirement justified? Right. So, as I said a while ago, an ethical theory provides with allows us to think of what are the salient aspects or issues, or shall we say facts that we need to look for, right? So we consider, for example, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, that means the greatest good for the greatest number. When we say the greatest good, what greatest good are we talking about here? Then this is the greatest good of shall we say certain types of tuberculosis patients being cured because of an add-on. No, but the greatest number, ideally this would be all tuberculosis patients with a specific case on which the add-on will be useful for. Yeah, but then we can also say greatest number for which country. That can also be an issue, right? Or it could be also the greatest good for whom? Is it really for the patients? or is it for example, for pharma? And if we so these are all the salient cases and things that we have to think about if we're using utilitarianism. But we can also say the greatest good for the greatest number for now, or is it also only after a certain amount of time, or is it good for a group of people for now, and after 10 years, good for a group of people somewhere else? So these are all questions that we think about once we start using, for example, utilitarianism to reflect on it. But we can also use, we can also think about this in a very, shall we say, Kantian way, right? In this particular case, are the research participants, if they're not provided with post-trial access, are they being used merely as means? Or maybe we can also ask, we can also phrase the question differently. Is it a requirement is it an ethical requirement because we treat the other persons not merely as means, but also always as an end, that they are provided post-trial access to the drug in case the drug is proven to be safe and effective after a trial? Yeah, and maybe corollary to that, remember we were talking about responsibilities of the government and of great institutions in Martha Nussbaum's approach. Who is really responsible for providing such an access? Is it the sponsor? And if it's the sponsor, how big is this responsibility? You know, when we start looking into the relationships. Right? We can also reflect on this using the principles approach, right? So clearly we're talking about the principle of beneficence here. But is it against the principle of non-maleficence that we do not, and is it also against the principle of justice and fairness that we do not provide post-trial access? Right. So so this is so as we see, depending on what ethical theory we see different salient points, but also using different ethical theories makes us see one salient point that maybe that maybe another ethical theory might not be looking into. Okay. Okay, and then we can look into the second case, which I have here in front of me. So this is the case of clinical trials in low and middle income countries. That's not really responsive to the greatest needs of the low and middle income countries, but rather are responsive to the greatest needs of high income countries. So in this case, are these trials justified? Again, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number. Is it in such a case, is it for the greatest good for the greatest number that there is plainly a drug? Yeah. Or is this, and if we're talking about greatest good for the greatest number, are we only talking about the recipient population or only of the sponsor's population? Now, we might also look into it again in a Kantian manner, and not only the utilitarian manner, and say, well, okay, we might be talking about a drug that benefits mostly high-income nations, and in doing so, are we merely using the participants in low and middle income countries as means, or also as ends? But to know that, we probably would also want to ask other issues, you know, like will they be provided post-trial access, which is not stipulated in the case, and if they will be, what kind of access will they be provided to, up to when? We probably would also want to look at it in a principle. We might want to look or reflect on it using principles approach and say, yes, so it talks about beneficence, yeah, but might also be, but can we also talk about beneficence in a bigger setting, such that we talk about high income countries and low middle income countries and not only of individuals, but also non-maleficence. Are we being hurtful to low and middle income countries if we do a clinical trial that benefits mostly high income countries, but do the trials in low and middle income countries? So shortly, ethical theories provide us anchors to know what the salient issues are, but also provides us ways to reach some kind of a solution or a decision. It might be that the solution is not necessarily the most optimal. An ethical choice is not necessarily something that makes us feel very good. There are times when an ethical issue, especially if it's a dilemma, leaves some remnants in there, right? But an ethical issue, but an ethical choice is an ethical choice because given everything, given all the considerations, it is either something that gives the greatest good for the greatest number, or because it allows us to respect the rights, dignity, or the duty towards other persons, or because it allows us to it allows us to contribute towards human flourishing, so on and so forth. Thank you very much for listening, and until next time.